Okay, 38 who saw murder didn't call the police. You can tell right off the bat that the title is kind of odd. It's actually a headline for a newspaper article. This appeared in the New York Times 2 weeks after the 1964 murder case of Kitty Genovese. Martin Gainsbourg, he was a native of Brooklyn. He lived in New York, and he was an editor for the New York Times for 43 years. So this is definitely somebody who has experience in the field. Also, in our Patterns textbook, we've been talking about the difference between subjective and objective. This will come across as objective, sort of, somebody who's trying to remain neutral, but Gainsbourg does a really good job of conveying exactly how he feels about this situation by using particular language and analogies and the way he uses the syntax. So I think you'll find it interesting. Background on the Kitty Genovese murder case. The events reported here took place on March 14th, 1964, as contemporary American culture was undergoing a complex transition. The relatively placid years of the 1950s were giving way to more troubling times. The civil rights movement was leading to social unrest in the South and in northern inner cities. The escalating war in Vietnam was creating angry political divisions. President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated just 4 months earlier. Violent imagery was increasing in television and film. Crime rates were rising, and a growing drug culture was becoming apparent. So this is a very tumultuous time in our history, and a lot is going down. And so really the fabric of what America is and what it means is changing in the mid-60s. So the brutal, senseless murder of Kitty Genovese, and more important, her neighbor's failure to respond immediately to her cries for help, became a nationwide and even worldwide symbol for what was perceived as an evolving culture of violence and indifference. In recent years, some of the details Gainsbourg mentions have been challenged. For example, as the New York Times now acknowledges, there were only 2 attacks on Miss Genovese, not 3. The first attack may have been shorter than first reported. The second attack may have occurred in the apartment house foyer, where neighbors would not have been able to see Genovese. And some witnesses may in fact actually have called the police. At the time, however, the world was shocked by the incident, and even today, social scientists around the world debate the causes of the Genovese syndrome. Okay, so let's look at our next. This is actually the little alleyway where she was murdered at. And then here's a picture of her and another view. Also, I've included on your Blackboard shell a quick little It's really neat. It's like a psychological study on the Genovese syndrome, and you can see when people are actually put in certain situations, how we handle them. And if you'll watch that after you read the story, I think it'll change your perception, change how you would have handled things. So let's go ahead and read this. For more than half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens. Now let's stop right there. So we're using an objective point of view, so we don't want to show bias. Now, Gainsbourg is really quite clever here because he's being sarcastic, isn't he? Because respectable, law-abiding citizens do not watch a killer stalk and stab a woman. So he's being sarcastic. Twice their chatter and sudden glow of their bedroom lights interrupted him and frightened him off. Each time he returned, sought her out, and stabbed her again. Not one person telephoned the police during the assault. One witness called after the woman was dead. That was 2 weeks ago today. Still shocked is Assistant Chief Inspector Frederick M. Lewson, in charge of the borough's detectives and a veteran of 25 years of homicide investigations. He can give a matter-of-fact recitation on many murders, but the Kew Gardens slaying baffles him. Not because it is a murder, but because the good people failed to call the police. And notice good people is in quotation marks, not only because that is what the officer said, the inspector said, but I think it's also meant to be like, when you say things and you do the air quotations, good people failed to call the police. As we have reconstructed the crime, he said, the assailant had 3 chances to kill this woman during a 35-minute period. He returned twice to complete the job. If we had been called when he first attacked, the woman might not be dead now. This is what the police say happened beginning at 3:20 a.m. in the staid, middle-class, tree-lined Austin Street area. Now, this is important that he's describing the area that she lives in, right? So, unlike Junot Diaz's apartment complex that he lived in, where people just naturally assumed they would be broken into, violence was just something that occurred on a pretty daily basis and wasn't much to be surprised at. But here we have a middle-class, tree-lined Austin Street area. This is basically sort of ramming at home that this could happen to any one of us, right? This isn't just, those poor people who live down in the barrio. No, this is in our neighborhoods, okay? Also notice the time. It's 3:20 a.m. And we're going to talk a little bit about Kitty Genovese as we go on. 28-year-old Catherine Genovese, who was called Kitty by almost everyone in the neighborhood, was returning home from her job as manager of a bar in Hollis. She parked a red Fiat in a lot adjacent to the Kew Gardens Long Island Railroad station, facing Mowbray Place. Like many residents of the neighborhood, she had parked there day after day. Since her arrival from Connecticut a year ago, although the railroad frowns on the practice. So, Kitty Genovese worked in a bar, and she didn't get home until 3:20 in the morning, right? So, I'm sure as we're moving into the mid-60s, we still have a lot of individuals who have that mindset, right? We're sort of moving from leave it to beaver, a sort of mentality of a nuclear family, into, as many would argue at that particular time, the collapse of the American family. Is it appropriate for a 28-year-old woman to be out at 3:20 a.m. in the morning? Right? So, this is also an interesting fact about this case, that people didn't call and help Kitty because perhaps they thought that she was a lower class citizen than them. And this is something to think about as we read this story. She turned off the lights of her car, locked the door, and started to walk the 100 feet to the entrance of her apartment at 8270 Austin Street, which is in a Tudor building, with stores in the first floor and apartments on the second. The entrance to the apartment is in the rear of the building because the front is rented to retail stores. At night, the quiet neighborhood is shrouded in the slumbering darkness that marks most residential areas. Now, this is a really interesting description. At night, the quiet neighborhood is shrouded in the slumbering darkness. When you hear the word shroud, I think more along the lines of like a burial shroud or something relating to death. Sometimes if somebody's describing the quiet of night, they'll say like, and as the stars blanketed our little village, we all slept soundly in our beds. That's not the type of description here. We get a very ominous description. So Gainsbourg is very intentional with his words. Miss Genovese noticed a man at the far end of the lot, near a 7-story apartment house at 8240 Austin Street. She halted. Then nervously she headed up Austin Street toward Lefferts Boulevard, where there is a call box to the 102nd Police Precinct nearby Richmond Hill. She got as far as a street light in front of a bookstore before the man grabbed her. She screamed. Lights went on in the 10-story apartment house at 8267 Austin Street, which faces the bookstore. Windows slid open and voices punctuated the early morning stillness. Miss Genovese screamed, "Oh my God, he stabbed me! Please help me! Please help me!" From one of the upper windows in the apartment house, a man called down, Let that girl alone." The assailant looked up at him, shrugged, and walked down Austin Street toward a white sedan parked a short distance away. Miss Genovese struggled to her feet. Lights went out. The killer returned to Miss Genovese, now trying to make her way around the side of the building by the parking lot to get to her apartment. The assailant stabbed her again. "I'm dying!" she shrieked. "I'm dying!" Windows were opened again and lights went on in many apartments. The assailant got into his car and drove away. Miss Genovese staggered to her feet. A city bus, 010, the Lefferts Boulevard line to Kennedy International Airport, passed. It was 3:35 a.m. The assailant returned. By then, Miss Genovese had crawled to the back of the building, where the freshly painted brown doors to the apartment house held out hope for safety. The killer tried the first door. She wasn't there. At the second door, 82 to 62 Austin Street, he saw her slumped on the floor at the foot of the stairs. He stabbed her a third time, fatally. It was 3:50 by the time the police received their first call from a man who was a neighbor of Miss Genovese. In 2 minutes they were at the scene. The neighbor, a 70-year-old woman, and another woman were the only persons on the street. Nobody else came forward. The man explained that he had called the police after much deliberation. He had phoned a friend in Nassau County for advice, and then he had crossed the roof of the building to the apartment of the elderly woman to get her to make the call. "I didn't want to get involved," he sheepishly told the police. I can't even freaking imagine this. Can you imagine you're seeing a woman getting murdered on the street? So I'm going to call a friend and ask what I should do. And then when my friend tells me, well, you really ought to do something, I'll just go across the way and ask this woman to call the police because I don't really want to get involved. This is heartbreaking to me. 6 days later, the police arrested Winston Mosley, a 29-year-old business machine operator, and charged him with homicide. Mosley had no previous record. He's married, has 2 children, and owns a home at 13319 Sutter Avenue, South Ozone Park, Queens. On Wednesday, a court committed him to Kings County Hospital for psychiatric observation. Did you notice they gave this man's address? Why do you think they would do that? It's something to think about. Do they want to show that he's just a regular guy? That he is not just some deranged killer who has no family, who sleeps in an alleyway somewhere. This is a normal guy. Of course, he's crazy, so he's not exactly normal. When questioned by the police, Mosley also said that he had slain Miss Annie Mae Johnson, 24, of 14612 133D Avenue, Jamaica, on February 29th, and Barbara Kralik, 15, of 174 17 140th Avenue, Springfield Gardens, last July. In the Kralik case, the police are holding Alvin L. Mitchell, who is said to have confessed to the slaying. The police stressed how simple it would have been to have gotten in touch with them. A phone call, said one of the detectives, would have done it. The police may be reached by dialing 0 for operator or SPRING 7 3100. Now, this is interesting because he tells us how to phone the police, right? Why is he giving us this information? Well, first of all, so this doesn't happen again, but then secondly, to show us how easy it would have been to call the police and perhaps help this woman. Today, witnesses from the neighborhood, which is made up of one-family homes in the $35,000 to $60,000 range, with the exception of the 2 apartment houses near the railroad station, find it difficult to explain why they didn't call the police. So let's think about this. We have a middle-class, nice neighborhood, $35,000 to $60,000 homes, and in 1964, that was a significant amount of money. And then across the street are these apartment buildings where people who work at bars until 3:20-something a.m. at night come strolling in. Do you think these middle-class individuals enjoy having those apartment buildings so near their homes? Do you think that they would be so inclined to help the individuals who lived there? Or do you think perhaps they saw them as lower-class citizens? It's something to think about. when you're thinking about agendas and why these people didn't call. Or perhaps they just truly were scared. I don't know. But these are things that this article sort of evokes. It invokes thought, right? A housewife knowingly, if quite casually, said, "We thought it was a lover's quarrel." A husband and wife both said, "Frankly, we were afraid." They seemed aware of the fact that events might have been different. A distraught woman, wiping her hands in her apron, said, "I didn't want my husband to get involved." One couple now willing to talk about that night said they heard the first screams. The husband looked thoughtfully at the bookstore where the killer first grabbed Miss Genovese. "We went to the window to see what was happening," he said, "but the light from our bedroom made it difficult to see the street." The wife, still apprehensive, added, "I put out the light and we were able to see better." Oh my gosh, that is so infuriating, isn't it? We went to see at the window what was happening. We couldn't see very well, so we turned out the light, and then we could really watch him stab her. Isn't that a terrible, terrible thing? Asked why they hadn't called the police, she shrugged and replied, "I don't know." A man peeked out from a slight opening in the doorway to his apartment and rattled off an account of the killer's second attack. Why hadn't he called the police at the time? "Well, I was tired," he said without emotion. "I went back to bed." It was 4:25 a.m. when the ambulance arrived to take the body of Miss Genovese. It drove off. Then, a solemn police detective said, "The people came out." Ugh, that is an infuriating essay, but it's just one that we all need to read and think about. Make sure you watch the video on the Genovese syndrome that I've included in the Blackboard shell. I think you'll find it interesting. So, hope you enjoyed it.